Hello, and welcome to what we'll be celebrating this weekend, the sixth Sunday or weekend of Easter. The readings, first reading comes from the book of the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, and then it skips around a little, verses 25 and 26, verses 34 and 35, verses 44 and 48. We're going to look at that work of Acts a little bit to see what goes on there and why that's taking place. The second reading is from the first letter of John, chapter 4, verses 7 and 10 through 10, and then the gospel, again, John, chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. Now, the gospel continues exactly where it left off last Sunday. Remember, last Sunday it began with verse 1, went through verse 8, now it's verse 9 to verse 17. So we'll look at that a little bit as the connection and how really it is all one piece, but for the sake of the Sundays has been divided. The book of the Acts of the Apostles, as you remember, is the complementary work of the third gospel writer, Luke. And in it, he develops the story of the development of the Christian experience, beginning in Jerusalem and then beginning to spread northwest. I say that because it's the Mediterranean Sea here that is the center. In this work, the chapter that begins with 10 and goes all the way to chapter 15 really is centered around one major event. And in that sense, perhaps this story centers the whole work. Now, that's one way to look at it. It is a story because, after all, one of the things that Luke needs to or wanted to help others understand, is how a movement that began within Judaism, which Jesus, of course, had grown up as a Hebrew. Those who were part of his experience were all Jews. The first believers in the message of Jesus were also of the Jewish tradition. How it came about that the outsiders, the Gentiles, became a part of that story and a part of that movement. And of course, this is really our story. So Luke, by the time that he writes this work, is aware that the spread of Christianity has moved beyond the cycle or circles of Judaism into other areas of, the Mediterranean world, but also other areas besides Judaism. So, how does he do this? He does it by centering around a basic story or event that involves none other than who, of course, sort of is the hero of the first part of the book of Acts, Peter. And although Paul will be remembered later on as the apostle to the Gentiles, as we will see, the essential break in how the movement that was basically Jewish became also extended into the Gentile experience took place is connected with Peter. Now, that's the background a little bit for what develops in chapter 10 and really runs through, as I mentioned, the next 5 chapters. The same event, the same story, actually told 3 times. Now, of course, one of the characteristics, if you want to be a good teacher, they say, is don't expect students or people to pick it up always the first time. And maybe they will see it better the second time, but by the third time are able to understand it. So that's the background of what's going to happen in the book of Acts. Now, what we're going to hear in the selected reading for this weekend is only a very abbreviated part of that, really a conclusion, and I thought it might be helpful to review just how events leading up to the conclusion took place. It begins in this way, as chapter 10 of Acts starts, that there was a Roman soldier, really an army officer of the Italian branch, named Cornelius, who is stationed at Caesarea Philippi, or Caesarea, not Philippi, but Caesarea Maritima, the harbor that I think we mentioned before had been built by Herod the Great, and not only a harbor, but also a whole city. And it became the residence place of the Romans when, particularly the most famous of them was of Pontius Pilate, who when they came to Israel would stay there. And only when it was needed did they go up to Jerusalem to take care of things. We have very little evidence of who was at Caesarea Maritima, but there has been found, and it's one of those pictures that you frequently see, a stone in which is inscribed on the stone a number of names, and among them Pontius Pilate. And that, of course, rings a bell with the Christians and who his role was in the story of Jesus. Cornelius is in charge of a group, 100 men, and it was known as the Italian Brigade for whatever reason. Now, Luke gives a lot of little information like this, of course, to make a good story, make a good narration. He also points out that Cornelius was a God-fearer. Now, this is an interesting term. It appears only in Luke's work. A God-fearer was, as best we can put it together, a person who was very interested in Judaism, who may even have gone so far as to be circumcised, but who had never yet formally embraced the religion of Hebrewism or Judaism. So a God-fearer, and there apparently were a number of people attracted to Judaism. I suppose something like we would say they were catechumens. They were learning what it meant to be a Jew. They often went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So they were quite familiar with the law and with all that was connected with the Mosaic tradition. Cornelius is pictured as being that kind of person. And apparently, not only Cornelius, but also his family. Now, this raises questions as to how many or who exactly made up the family. We do know that it tended to be today what we would call an extended family, so that would have been those within his immediate family, but also would have included servants, slaves, etc. So this is the background for this man, as I say, garrisoned at what was then known as Stratton's Tower, which is Caesarea Maritima. He also is characterized, as Luke introduces us to him, as very generous to the poor and who prayed to God constantly. Now, both of those are characteristics that Luke often includes in developing his stories. The importance of caring for the poor, generosity, and that's not just say, oh, I'm sorry you're poor, but financially, practically helping the poor. And also prayer, which is an important dimension to Luke's story. And so the story goes, as Luke now develops it, that at the ninth hour, now remember we talked about this, the ninth hour by our terms would be 3 p.m., that the calendar was divided into two equal sections, the night and the day. Night began at 6 and went to 6 a.m., and then the vice versa, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. was the day. This, by the way, was a set time for prayer in Judaism. Up in Jerusalem, they would offer sacrifice, but if you couldn't be there, you at least set some time aside to pray. And as this occurs, on one occasion, Cornelius has the vision of an angel. And the angel says to him, "Your prayers and your almsgiving have been heard, and the Lord is pleased with what you have done." Now, Cornelius then raises the question, this angel of the Lord, well, what is it? What am I supposed to do? Well, he says, there's a certain man in Joppa named Saul, named Peter. Go to Joppa and go to meet with him, and he will tell you what to do. So this is the way the story begins. A vision from God to Cornelius. He doesn't go himself, but he sends messengers to Joppa. Now, Joppa, of course, those of you who have a little map will see Caesarea Maritima is here. Joppa is going up north again against the Mediterranean, was the only other natural seaport in Palestine. Maritima was a homemade, an artificially created one by Herod. Now, as this is going on, so these two messengers are sent by Cornelius. Up in Joppa, at the home of the tanner, happens to be Peter. And Peter decides that he will go up on the roof of the house where he is staying, and he will pray. But it's also noon, or if we're listening, it's the 6th hour. Remember, 6. So at the same time, it's noon, and he is it's all well and good to pray, but he's also hungry. And as he is up on the roof, this experience happens that a trance happens. And in the trance, a vast net opens before him of all kinds of animals and snakes. And Peter is invited to take some of this for his food. He makes the move to avoid certain animals in the net. And the voice of God says, "No, I have created all these creatures, and all of them are good." Now, you remember in Judaism that there were certain meats that the Jews would not eat, or the law said to be avoided. So in this vision now, the message of God is that this idea of excluding some of the animals as not good was not the wish of God. So Peter has this vision, but he's not sure what this is all about. Why is he getting this vision? What does this have, or trance, but it really is a vision. What does this have to do with anything? And just as he is kind of contemplating this and wrestling with this, there's a knock on the door, and the two envoys who had come from Cornelius are there. They say, "Is there a Peter here?" And the answer is yes. And they go to Peter and they explain that they have been sent by Cornelius and asked to bring him to Caesarea to kind of talk to them. Peter is a little bit put back, but begins to suspect that there's something at work here that is of the divineness. Peter, however, immediately does the right thing with these two envoys. He invites them in, hospitality, which of course we've mentioned before is the basic quality of Judaism. Now, whether or not Peter served any of those snakes that he caught, I don't know. It doesn't tell us, but he does say that he provided them with a meal, and then he was escorted by them over or down, I guess you would say, to Caesarea. When he comes, he meets Cornelius. Cornelius then relates to him. So you can begin to see how this is going to take a bit of material in this section of the Acts. He again tells Peter all of the things that he has experienced, the same vision, developing it, explaining it. And as he has done this, the understanding of what exactly is taking place becomes clearer to Peter. Peter now, so this is the first part, chapter 10, verses 23 to 33, the exchange between Peter and Cornelius. Peter now proceeds in the next 13 verses, to give the gospel message. And again, typical of the way in which the story of salvation has been narrated by Luke, Peter gives this. As soon as Peter is finished, there is a coming of the Holy Spirit. Interestingly, within the Acts of the Apostles, the coming of the Holy Spirit actually occurs 4 different times. The one we observe at Pentecost, of course, is the first and most famous, but here's another one. And so as this coming of the Spirit upon the household of Cornelius, he's there, but also all those who make up his household, as I mentioned, finds Peter saying, well, now I get it. And having received the Spirit, he now baptizes Cornelius and his family. And they sit down to a table of fellowship. So you get all of the Lucan characteristics of the story, but what is important here is Peter now eats with Gentiles, which breaks the code. He had already, though, kind of broken it if you go back a moment to see that when he invited the Gentiles in for that lunch, he too was beginning to break down the walls that separated Judaism from the Gentiles. So this is a crisis moment in Christianity, that the respected leader has brought into the fold of Christianity Gentiles. Now, yes, they were God-fearers, but nevertheless, they were not Jewish, and therefore the inclusiveness of the gospel is beginning to take place. Now Peter has to return back up to Jerusalem. And this again is the next part of Acts. And as Peter comes back up, he is greeted by some of the folks up in Jerusalem, and the word is, we've heard rumors that you've been wining and dining with the Gentiles. What about this? And now, Peter, to the assembled in Jerusalem, I don't know if they sat down, but now gives the whole narration again, the whole event that happened to Cornelius, the whole event that happened to Peter on the rooftop, the whole event of what happened when he went down with to Cornelius and his family. So the whole sequence of events is narrated again. See, this is why I'm saying it's the bulk of this section, but it gets rather lengthy. And I suppose we as the readers say, I heard that already, but this is important because it's reinforcing the idea of bringing into the faith family those who were the outsiders or the Gentiles. So this is the pattern now that is being set in place by Luke that maybe fellow Christians should follow. Peter has shown it. his decision to provide hospitality to the Gentiles. He visits their home. He preaches to them. He confirms God's bestowal of the Spirit. The ritual of baptism takes place, and now he defends that decision that he made. So those up in Jerusalem are now informed that something different is happening within the Christian experience, and that the Holy Spirit is really at work in expanding the news and the message of the risen Jesus. So that's the drift of this whole section. As I mentioned, it's a major part of the Acts. I would say it's not the centering chapter, but you also remember that the idea of dividing the book up into chapters and verses is something which the church later on did. So the story of salvation is not just for the Hebrew community, but it is also for the others. So that's, I think now, what's the little section that we hear, having given you the whole story, it's going to be much abbreviated in the sections that we hear in the reading this weekend, which simply finds Peter as affirming that it's all right to bring into the faith outsiders, that they receive the Holy Spirit, and that for this reason, the church is growing and becoming stronger. The Gospel of John, as I mentioned, continues where it left off last week. You remember last week, the imagery is that of the vine and the branches. Jesus is the vine, we are the branches, and God is the vine grower who cares for it. Once again, then this is reiterated. Now, as chapter 15 continues in verse 9, it reiterates what is really the message of the metaphor of the vine and the branches. The Father has loved me, so I have loved you, says Jesus, and he then says, abide in me. So you can see the idea of abiding in me really is picked up from the idea of the branches with the vine, that they need one another, and that certainly the branches need the vine in order to have life and in order to be sustained. If you abide in me, as this little section now of John continues, you will keep my commandments. Now, what does that mean? What is the commandment that Jesus has given? Well, we're more than familiar with that. But it basically means that we as the branches should do what we see the vine doing. So to abide or to love is not simply an affirmation, oh, I love you, but it must be exemplified by action, by carried out in some ways. So the disciples are to love one another because Jesus has prior love for them before his death. Now keep in mind that this section are words of Jesus given at the time of the Last Supper. That we've mentioned this before. There are a number of metaphors that are used in John's Gospel. In John's long picture of Jesus' discussion or dialogue at the Last Supper, this is one of them, the vine and the branches. Abiding, okay. Well, abiding here involves also the willingness. After all, if you're going to abide, you're going to have a friendship. But a friendship which Jesus says goes so far as that I am willing to lay down my life for those that I love. It's not simply word, but by its action. Now, connected here, and this is always kind of tricky with the Gospel of John, he will begin images, but never totally sometimes finishes them and brings them back again. So I lay down my life for those I love. I remember hearing that when we last time or 2 times ago heard the story of the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd is the one who will lay down his life for his sheep. So here's that idea of the Good Shepherd brought into one of the verses that we're hearing this time. I lay down my life for my sheep, and you, followers, hopefully will lay down your life for one another. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that the disciples are going to have to die as Jesus did? Well, not necessarily, but it is a reminder that those who would abide in the love of Jesus, in the love that God has shared with his Son, and which the Son in turn shares with the vine with the branches. So once again, that imagery comes at the very end of the verses that we're hearing. So you can see how a lot of things are brought into connection in John's Gospel. And that reminds us, see, that we, of course, mentioned this a little bit earlier today, we divide the works of the Bible into chapters and verses. But when you take away that, if you think about it, that originally there weren't chapters and verses, well, then as this material flows, it doesn't seem so strange that something mentioned a little earlier reappears or reoccurs again, because it's all part of the larger unfolding story. So to do the commandments of Jesus, as John sees it, and this is well brought out, by the way, in sections of the first letter of John that we've been also listening to during these Easter days, as you probably notice, refer very often to the love that God has for us, that the love that Jesus has, that the love that we should have for one another. Thus, this is my commandment. Love others, love one another as I love you. Now, this love that you're supposed to have, think about it. It all sounds very wonderful, a little poetic, and certainly very spiritual. But think about it. Did the disciples all get along with one another so perfectly that they could really love them with that kind of love that Jesus was talking about? We perhaps a little bit idealize the others. Now, Luke, in his work, tends to do that. John is a little bit more honest. It may be difficult to love some people. I know we all hear it, you got to love them, not like them. But this is a love that is willing to go to certain extremes. To love someone else who not only do you not agree with or who doesn't like you, can be very challenging. And so the Gospel of John, to its credit, argues that that is the challenge that Jesus continually brings to his disciples. My commandment is this. We've heard this and we hear it again. Love one another as I have loved you. So it is an invitation. It is a challenge that is given here at the supper to the disciples. But as John writes these words of Jesus, he is willing to go even to, and we're not quite sure, to lay down his life for those he loved, might well have included Judas, who you remember had been at the supper with Jesus, had at a certain point left, but had broken bread with Jesus. So where are the limits to loving others in a certain way? And there's the challenge, as I mentioned, the invitation of John's work. It does not have limits. God's love is limitless. And I often think, well, that's true and that's wonderful. Ours, unfortunately, sometimes have limits. And what we hope, and one word that you might notice that also is used in the Gospel of John, that one might become a disciple. The word become is an active word. It doesn't mean you've already reached there. It means that we're working toward it. Well, this Sunday, as we kind of move toward the end of the Easter time, we hope that we have become more and more capable of extending that love that God has for us through Jesus to everyone, thus including those whom, as Luke pointed out in his story, includes, no matter who they are, all the sisters and brothers who have God as their Father. Thank you, and have a good week.